I'm going to call Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. The member, John O'Naylor, interjected a little bit earlier on. He was correcting Clayton Mitchell, I think, about the use of the word referendums, and he said no, he should be using the word referenda. And I'd just like to point out that a member who was on the select committee, the point I'm trying to make, Mr Mallard, is that the title of the bill is the New Zealand Flag Referendums Bill. And it's a bit concerning that a National MP who was on the select committee, who's been closely considering this legislation, giving it all the scrutiny that it deserves, didn't even know what the title of the bill was. So, I mean, but it's a fair question. I was a bit confused myself when I saw in clause 5 that in the interpretation clause that we have referendums, meaning the first flag referendum and the second flag referendum. But it turns out Trevor Mallard is correct. Referenda or for all referendums, we could use either. But the title of the bill is the New Zealand Flag Referendums Bill. And I would hope that the members of Parliament who are considering the legislation, well, referendums is in clause 5. Referendums is in clause 5 in the interpretation clause in part 1, which is what we're debating right now. And I would hope that the members who are so passionate about this legislation, who have been on the select committee, hearing the submissions, scrutinising this bill closely, might have even known what words, what terminology was being used in the legislation itself, sir. I'd like to move to clause 3, which is the purpose. I actually have some real concerns about the way clause 3 is worded, because you get the impression from reading clause 3 that what this bill would introduce would be first a referendum for electors to decide whether New Zealand should have a new flag, and then a referendum for electors to decide if we should change the flag. And that's certainly the way the purpose clause reads, and that's certainly what most New Zealanders want. If we're going to have a referendum, let's have the question first, do you want to change the flag? But that's not actually what the bill does. So this purpose clause is somewhat misleading, sir, because what the bill actually does is says that we have to have 2 referendums before the decision whether we're going to change the flag or not can be completed, which could result in an absolute waste of money. All the $26 million that's being spent on this could all come to naught if after 2 referendums the people of New Zealand say, no, actually, we don't want to change the flag. Why not trust the people of New Zealand in exactly the same way as we did with the question about changing the electoral system? Have the first question, do you want to change? And then we'll know whether it's worth proceeding on with the rest of the referendums, with the rest of the question and the rest of the expenditure that comes with it. And I've had a lot of feedback, sir, from people who say, look, I am interested in changing the flag, but it's a nice to have, not a must have. And when we're $101 billion in debt, and the government still hasn't achieved surplus and isn't going to start paying off debt for at least another 4 or 5 years, now is not the time for nice-to-haves like changing the flag. Now is the time to knuckle down and focus on things like housing, like things like jobs, things like making sure people have enough to get by, to put a roof over their heads and food on the table for their families. And so this purpose clause is extremely misleading, sir, and I think it really needs to be amended so that it actually represents what this legislation will do. I'd like to refer to clauses 6 and 7 as well, 2 clauses which haven't had as much attention in the debate so far. And I want to say something positive. Let's have something positive about this legislation. It's been few and far between because there's not a lot positive that you can say about this legislation. But the general description of the preferential voting electoral system, including the preferential voting electoral system for the decision about the flag options, I think is a good step forward. We do need to give people the opportunity to rank those flags. It would be a real shame if the flag people were being asked to change to was one that, say, only got 30% support from the general population and others just happen to get slightly less than that. So I'm glad that the Select Committee and the government listened to what Trevor Mallard was saying and what many others were saying, which is that actually the first past the post system was, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Well, Ian Lees-Galloway.
That the first past the post system was not appropriate for that decision around which of the 4 options that we'll eventually get to from this panel that's led by the likes of Julie Christie and others who will determine which of those 4... She doesn't quite lead it?
A really good guy, Burrows, is leading it.
Okay, right.
She's in charge of wasting the money.
She's in charge of wasting the money. Thank you for the clarification. So the 4 options that we'll get, we'll be able to decide which of those options we prefer through a preferential voting system. I'm not convinced that clause 7 and the inclusion of the first past the post electoral system for the second referendum is entirely necessary, because by definition, when you've only got 2 options, it essentially by default becomes a first past the post election. So I think that the inclusion of that description is actually entirely unnecessary, because even if it was technically a preferential voting system, when you've only got 2 options, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And so possibly we've got some redundant material in here, sir, with clause 7 and the other clauses that relate to the first past the post system. I find clause 8, as someone who wasn't on the select committee, and I'd be very happy if any of the members on the select committee would be able to advise us on this, the application of the Act to conduct outside of New Zealand. The Act applies in respect to the publication of a referendum advertisement in New Zealand, that's A, and 8B refers to outside of New Zealand. Now, there might be some really good reasons why that's been included, and I would like to know what they are, but it's a little bit concerning that the Act appears at a superficial level anyway, to allow for influence outside of New Zealand on a decision about our New Zealand flag. And as I say, there may be good arguments for that. I would really appreciate it if the members who have so closely scrutinised this legislation at Select Committee could give the House an explanation as to why Clause 8 is actually necessary. So coming back to the interpretation clause, panel, the word panel means any panel appointed by the Minister to conduct on behalf of the New Zealand Government a publicity campaign or other activity in relation to a referendum or referendums. And I suppose this is where a lot of the concern comes from. Yes, referendums, Mr. Naylor. And it's why it's in relation to a referendum, I'm not sure, because we know there's going to be more than one referendum. But this panel is actually probably the source of a lot of the concern that people have had. The expense that has been spent on this panel, on getting expensive people to sit on the panel and to travel around the countryside, spending over $2,000 per person who comes to one of their meetings, and receiving designs for the flag which have all sorts of unusual things on them, kiwis with laser beams, sheep with rainbows coming out of their backsides, and all sorts of things. And I am told they are the nicer ones, that's right. This panel has been a source of a lot of the concern, a lot of the conjecture out there amongst people, because it just does seem like the government has spent an awful lot of money on that panel, on a process which seems more like a publicity campaign, a PR campaign for the government and for the Prime Minister as part of his vanity project, his desperate attempt to have some kind of legacy that the historians will in the future actually have something to remember him by, because there isn't an awful lot else that people will be able to remember Mr. Key for. sir. So a number of questions in there that maybe the Minister might be able to answer. I know the Minister who's currently in the chair probably hasn't been terribly close to this process, but maybe members on the Select Committee might be able to make a contribution to the House and enlighten those of us who weren't sitting on the Select Committee considering the New Zealand flag referendums bill closely, and they might be able to enlighten us as to exactly what some of those issues that I've raised actually are all about, and why they've been included in the legislation.
Mr. Chair.